our committee. Thank you. By thanking our committee, Alan Fisher and John Levinson, who's actually in Italy, and Diana Bloom, who's here with me. And we're doing really important work. I don't know how many of you kind of like keep up with things kind of as they're happening, but the last few days have been really upsetting with the Sierra Club canceling trips to Israel. And the JCRC, who we learned with last week, Ty Gregory, jumped into their community problem-solving mode. They met with them, and the Sierra Club backed off of its stance. In fact, they reversed it and sent out a really thoughtful note. And so it's the power of what we can do. And, for me, I want to take the, people who've been coming to this series and really say, what are you each going to do? What are we going to do? Because our work is so important. And tonight's a really, really important night. And to introduce our speaker, Alina, there was a beautiful article written about you in Tablet Magazine about a year ago, which I will send out so that people here can read. And it began by talking about how you were a former high-tech manager who just stepped down as senior VP from a large affordable housing nonprofit. And you kind of heard about ethnic studies curricula and thought, what a nice thing. We're going to build bridges between people of understanding. And I loved your quote. This was as welcome as mom and apple pie, offering students the chance to learn about accomplishments of ethnic minorities, as well as to address issues of inequality and bigotry. And then when you read the draft curricula, it was like, oh my goodness, this is anything but that. And as a matter of fact, in terms of the series that we're talking about, the sample curricula was full of actually explicit anti-Semitism, was full of veiled references, which used all of those things that we've been learning about in terms of characterizations of Jews. It was really dangerous curricula. And a lot has happened since then in terms of things at the state level, things at school board level. And we really, really need to learn from you. Just so that people know, Alina is a mother of 2 growing children. And what she did is she kind of pulled together her skills. I actually think it's important to note that you're from the former Soviet Union, from the Ukraine, especially now.
From Belarus.
Especially now.
From
I'm
Belarus.
sorry.
Belarus. From Minsk,
Belarus, I'm
Belarus.
sorry.
Close.
Minsk, right?
Close. Yep. Very good.
Okay, gosh. I have to keep my Minsk is...
We used to think it was all the same, and we're learning very quickly that it's not.
Right, Belarus. Thank you. And you marshaled your skills and you created a nonprofit, co-created with 2 other women, the Alliance for Constructive Ethnic Studies, ACES. And on the website, you describe ACES as a diverse, nonpartisan coalition working to remove narrow ideological agendas from ethnic studies, enabling curricula that inspire mutual respect, fight racism, and celebrate ethnic accomplishments. So boy, thank you. We are blessed to have you. And I will turn the evening over to you, and then we'll jump in with questions and reflections on what we're going to do.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Ezra, and thank you to Diana Blum and Alan Fisher and the committee for organizing this really important series of events, and of course, Rabbi Ezra for his leadership, and to Rebecca Schwartz for providing the programmatic support. I wanted to note that as you think of questions or comments, please put them in the chat. So I think what we're going to do is I'll go through a PowerPoint. And since there aren't that many of us, please do feel free to, I think I'm going to say, raise your hand, and maybe Rebecca, I'll ask you to interrupt if you feel like we should in the middle of the presentation, if somebody has a burning question, but otherwise we'll wait until the end and I'll go through the questions in the chat. All right, so a little while ago, the son of a Jewish friend of mine said in passing, they were just on a drive home, something about colonial powers such as the US and Israel. It's a high schooler. So she asked, why is Israel a colonial power, to which he replied very matter-of-factly, well, Israel was built on Palestinian land. So my friend responded with one of those mini lessons that some of us are probably used to giving to our kids about 3,000-year history of Jews in the land of Israel, misinformation, and so on and so forth. Many of you, I'm sure, know the drill. I could tell when she was telling me the story that she assumed that the misinformation came from a peer of her son, and that he was simply repeating the peer's words. So I suggested that she ask where it came from, and sure enough, guess where it came from? It came from a teacher in a classroom. I'm talking to you today because I believe that today's topic that we're discussing is the number one issue that Jews in America face today. And that this topic is where all forms of anti-Semitism will flow and are already flowing. And that's anti-Semitism in the classroom, anti-Semitism in our schools. As Rabbi Ezra said, I'm a co-founder of ACES, and I wanted to first say a few words about the connection of our topic, anti-Semitism in the classroom, to ethnic studies, because that's what I'm going to use as kind of a springboard and a case study, if you will. So ethnic studies is now a graduation requirement, is going to be a graduation requirement. There's a bill that passed for it to be a graduation requirement for all public and all charter schools in California, and private schools, as well as other states, are following suit. The kind of ethnic studies is not specified. And I know, by the way, that to many of you, this is review. So I'll try to balance between reviewing what many of you already know versus introducing a subject that some of you may not have heard about. So the kind of ethnic studies is not specified. And unlike with other subjects like math or even history, this matters, right? We don't feel the need to specify what kind of calculus, but with this particular subject, it makes a difference. The state's model curriculum, the ESMC, the Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum, it's abbreviated ESMC, we'll refer to it like that throughout today's session. The ESMC instructs teachers and districts to integrate ethnic studies into every grade and every subject. So it turns out that this narrow seeming subject is actually quite all-encompassing. So Rabbi Ezra mentioned what ACES is. Our goal is to bring constructive ethnic studies into classrooms, to bring the kind of ethnic studies that is, as Rabbi Ezra was referring to, I think of as mom and apple pie. In other words, we support ethnic studies, and we support the kind of ethnic studies that the vast majority of Californians and Americans would assume would be in schools. So that's where we're going to kick off. And I'm going to share screen. Hold on one moment. Right, let's see. So share screen. All right. Rebecca, could you nod if you see this? Are we good? We can see my share, or somebody nod if you can see the screen.
We're good.
We're seeing your slide, but we're also seeing your photo in the middle there.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay.
We're seeing the Zoom control.
Now we're good.
Awesome. Okay. Thank you. That's why you always need somebody to help for these with these things. All right. So, two models of ethnic studies. There is what we call a constructive ethnic studies model, and that's the one that builds bridges and emphasizes ethnic group contributions and accomplishments, talks about confronting racism and bigotry, and does so by approaching diverse strategies to do so. So looks at how can we approach racism in different ways. There's another area that's called critical or liberated ethnic studies. I'll use those interchangeably. And that model of ethnic studies emphasizes an oppressor-victim paradigm. So students and humans are basically put into either the oppressor box or the victim box. And the world is divided into these two groups of people. A specific ideology and movement is at the core of this. And the focus of this movement is to challenge, this is a quote from what they talk about, challenging imperialistic colonial hegemonic beliefs and practices. As we talk through this, bear with me until we get to the anti-Semitism part that's explicit. But those of you that have been on the forefront of fighting anti-Zionism and fighting BDS battles will understand very quickly how the anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism is creeping in a very natural, organic way into liberated ethnic studies. The area also emphasized militant resistance as a means to social change. So one visual that I was really struck by is this new cover of a book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which is the foundational text for critical ethnic studies. And you can see that it's a rifle with a pencil on top of it. I kind of did a double take when I first saw this because it was like, really? This is what we are putting out there as a foundational text in front of teachers to teach our children, that you learn about a pencil on top of a rifle. And one quote from this book talks about the oppressors who oppress, exploit, and rape by virtue of their power cannot find in this power the strength to liberate either the oppressed or themselves. So you kind of get a flavor for the, let's call it militant nature, kind of revolutionary nature of the approach. ACES believes very strongly in the constructive approach to ethnic studies. And that has to do with, as I mentioned before, building mutual respect, addressing racism honestly, presenting a range of political perspectives, and empowering students. So rather than placing them into boxes, empowering them from different perspectives to dream big. And that was actually consistent with the original objective when California first started on this path of ethnic studies, and that started with the ESMC, the Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum. The objective of that bill was preparing pupils to be global citizens with an appreciation for the contributions of multiple cultures. All right, so that sounds good, that sounds strong, right? It makes a lot of sense. We need that in our society today. Compare that to what the Critical Ethnic Studies Association aims to do. You see a lot of words like collectivized resistance to US imperialism, grounding our approaches for dismantling the neo-colonial schooling apparatus, right? And compare that, again, look at this, it's preparing students to appreciate, to be global citizens, appreciate multiple cultures, and then you compare it to that, very different. So how does that play out? Well, you can look at the guiding principles as a way to understand what is it that they're referring to. Some of it kind of sounds like gobbledygook, I will admit that, but you have to really concentrate on the words here to understand what they're trying to say. The themes are colonialism, hegemony, systems of power, anti-capitalism, and resistance in general. So you can see some of these words like critique empire and history, its relationship to white supremacy, racism, patriarchy, blah, 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 capitalism. So capitalism is being made equivalent to racism, for example, cis heteropatriarchy, which my kids were very annoyed with me that I wasn't able to roll off my tongue as they are, because this is a term that many of our children are certainly familiar with. So look at what the difference is in different types of guiding principles. And this is super important, right? And how this actually plays out in the classroom. So in one case, where the LESMC, the Liberated Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum, so this is, let's abbreviate it as liberated curriculum, right? Talks about connecting ourselves to resistance movements, talks about struggle, talks about a truer democracy. Those of you that are familiar with Marxism or actually studied in the former Soviet Union will hear something familiar, ensure democracy, because that term is a Marxist term for the abolition of private property. On the other hand, contrast that with a different guiding principle that comes from Los Angeles Unified School District that we consider as having constructive ethnic studies. This one focuses on experiences, histories, cultures, struggles, and accomplishments, and focuses on empathy and education. I'm just highlighting the underlined words. You can see, you can feel the difference in how this might play out in the classroom. One of the things that I really like looking at when I think about an ideology, it turns out, the more I've learned about this, the more I've learned that it's super helpful to look at who are the role models, who are the people that a particular ideology holds up as ones to look up to. And so you can see some of the role models that are listed in the initial drafts of the ethnic studies model curriculum. The reason that's relevant is that these are the same role models of the liberated folks. You can see these, a consistent choice of Marxist militants. And so you've got Oscar Lopez Rivera, who led a paramilitary Marxist-Leninist organization that was responsible for over 100 bombings in US cities. And you have one after another of them, just a preponderance. It's not that any individual of these is a problem, although one could argue that they are. That's not what I'm arguing. It's the preponderance of these figures. Compare that to who's missing, because that's also telling. And so some of the figures that are missing are ones as role models are ones that you would expect to be there. And those are people like Thurgood Marshall, Frederick Douglass, Norman Mineta, Yo-Yo Ma, all these figures that we automatically think of as role models in different ethnic groups. Who else is missing from one of those initial drafts or the initial multitude of initial drafts of the ESMC? Martin Luther King, John Lewis, other peaceful leaders that worked within the system. And in fact, civil rights leaders are literally described, and these are quotes, as passive and docile. Some of you have seen this quote from Clarence Jones, who is the speechwriter for Martin Luther King, who was pretty horrified to read the sections on African-American, at the time it was called African-American Studies. Now the LESMC refers to it as Black American Studies. Wrote about his plea for moral reasoning and decency and for respect for truth and accuracy. And he was referring to this emphasis on the more militant revolutionary approaches and the omitting of the more peaceful and within the system approaches to getting to change. So one of the questions that we're asked all the time is, how does critical race theory fit into all this? The critical race theory, which some of you have probably heard of by now. At the beginning, when we first started this, nobody knew about what it was. CRT, as it's abbreviated, has really been turned into this political football that both sides are throwing back and forth between media and talking heads. The term has pretty much lost all meaning. And the main concern, so I'm not going to get into CRT in general. What I'm just going to say about it is that the main concern in our context is not CRT in general, which is a legal theory examined in legal institutions and law schools, among many other theories. The issue is pushing this very specific ideological theory into K-12 schools and making it the lens through which subjects are taught. It's not about learning about it, it's about making it the lens. CRT is absolutely not talking about racism, and it is not teaching history honestly. Both of those are important, and you can do those, you can and should do those with constructive ethnic studies without dividing students into oppressor victim boxes, without imposing a specific ideological agenda, and without glorifying some of these role models that you saw. Something that really helps me to understand, again, the ideology is to look at, rather than looking at the analysis of what others are saying about the leaders of this liberated movement is actually listening to themselves. And so, for instance, we have these quotes from training in Santa Clara, very close to us, where the trainer was asked, but what about scaring away people through the Marxist underpinnings? And so this trainer was insisting that, yes, it can scare people away, but they must be grounded in the correct politics to educate students. And another, this next to it, what you're seeing is a poster from one of the leaders of liberated ethnic studies that talks about the idea that diversity and inclusion are not what we're talking about in ethnic studies. We're talking about a very particular ideology. This is not something that is hidden. This is something that's out there that they speak about very openly. This is a diagram from one of the other trainings where you can see settler colonialism at the very center, and then you have coming out of it. So there are two different ways that they're putting it. One is the roots with imperialism, and then the other is the different leaves. But you can see the idea that private property is equivalent to genocide, is equivalent to patriarchy, is equivalent to white supremacy, and all of it comes out of settler colonialism or imperialism. Again, with the focus on this very particular ideology. We can get back to this if people are interested in talking about some of this stuff. Just going on, said this idea that this came out of a document that talks about, it's a mathematics framework, California mathematics framework, that talks about characteristics of white supremacy culture. These are also all over the place. The idea that individualism, objectivity, and meritocracy are all characteristics of a white supremacy culture. And that's something that we see consistently, again, within that particular ideology. All right, so finally, let's get to the anti-Semitism piece. And I'll tell you let's look at this first, and then I'll tell you a little bit in terms of my personal connection to the subject of ethnic studies. I don't know how many of you saw this pyramid that was floating around. It was a few years ago, and there were flyers that were floating around some university campuses. The pyramid has, I'm not sure how clearly you can see it, but you can see that at the very top of the pyramid are the Jews. And the idea is that white privilege starts with ending Jewish privilege. Ending white privilege starts with ending Jewish privilege. This is very consistent, though often not explicitly said quite as clearly as this, but it comes from this misguided correlation between economic success and oppressor status, meaning that if you are in the economically successful strata, then it is automatically placing you into that oppressor box. So one example is students being required to write a paper talking about how Jewish and Irish Americans gained racial privilege. Much more explicit is the anti-Zionism and the pushing of the boycott, divestment, sanctions, the BDS movement against Israel. So the initial versions, the first draft of the ESMC outright said that students should participate in BDS and put it right up there along with the Me Too movement and the Black Lives Matter movement. That is an integral part of the liberated ethnic studies curriculum. It's not surprising because BDS and Israel condemnation are woven into the very fabric of liberated ethnic studies. All members of the founding board of this entire field are BDS activists. I mean, all 13 members. Here's a teacher training from Hayward Unified. Some of you may have seen this. It's a quote from Angela Davis that talks about how in Palestine, US, Arab countries, people who are seeking to maintain systems of oppression are sharing ideology, strategies, and weapons. And so it's talking about the global prison industrial complex being tested in extreme form in Palestine, making that connection between what's happening in Palestine with the Palestinians and anything and everything that happens with discrimination here against people of color. I'm going to skip this, 'cause I feel like I've been talking too long, so let's go to here. So the very first thing that the Liberated Ethnic Studies curriculum chose to publish was not anything about the Black Americans. It was not about Latino Americans. It was not about Asians, and it was not about Native Americans, which are supposedly the four core groups that the academic discipline of ethnic studies focuses on. Instead, the very first portion of the liberated curriculum that was published, it was called Teach Palestine Toolkit. The links have since been taken down. However, we have the document that I'll be happy to share that has the full text of it and the archive links that, that were posted. So it refers to, this toolkit refers to, and this is exactly what they were saying that they're planning on teaching, the current apartheid in Israel. It talks about making clear the connections, and this is what I was talking about in the previous slide, between the struggle for Palestinian rights and the struggle for pretty much everything else in the US. It coaches teachers to integrate Palestine into their curriculum by incorporating it into and a long list of everything that they can integrate it in. This is not theoretical anymore. This is real. This is what teachers are getting trained on right now. So why is this happening? Because some of this is so ridiculous and so bizarre that it's hard to believe that teachers are getting trained in this and this is entering the classroom. Much of it is under the radar, and as much as has come out in the last couple of years, the ethnic studies model curriculum is an example. The entire history of how that came about is a story of how far it can happen if you let things happen under the radar. The vast majority of parents, teachers still don't know. When you talk to people of color, many people of color, and of course I can't generalize, but I can tell you that it is absolutely not true that they will simply say, oh yes, of course, I support this liberated ethnic studies, because what they support is, like the rest of us, ethnic studies in general. And we hear from ethnic groups across the board that what bothers them is the idea of their kids being treated as a victim, learning that they were always a victim, are a victim, and will be a victim, is a problem from multiple perspectives. So it's not just those who are in the oppressor bucket. The Orwellian doublespeak certainly doesn't help here. So the idea of a truer democracy that's code for something else, words like critical hope, radical healing, critical pedagogy, all sound quite innocuous and our eyes kind of glaze over when we look through this, except that it turns out that they're all terms, they're all code words, if you will, for dismantling a system. When parents and teachers find out the result of what happens when this kind of teaching occurs, many are afraid to speak up. And this is where we need a critical mass. And I'll use the word critical differently here, which is that we need to get to a point, we need to start speaking up and get to a point where the more of us are speaking up, the more of us are pushing back, not against ethnic studies, not against talking about racism, not against teaching history honestly, but for teaching history honestly, and doing so without bigotry, without placing students into oppressor and oppressed, and without teaching anti-Zionism. Those two go hand in hand, because as long as the core of the ideology is that oppressor versus victim ideology, anti-Zionism will be interwoven with it. Momentum is absolutely starting to build, and we're getting there. We're getting to that critical mass that we need for accountability, to be able to say, wait a second, this is not what you're supposed to be teaching our children.
Alina, there was a really good question from Dan and Julie, kind of who or what is the organization promulgating this whole approach? How did it originate? Who's funding it? I mean, it seems so kind of vast in terms of what's put together.
Yeah, okay, let me stop share for a moment and then we'll come back to it. It's a great question, and it does often feel like it's giant. It's not as giant as we think, but it is driven by a very organized group of people. If you go to, let's see, I can put this in the chat. So the organization is called Liberated Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum. It goes under other names having to do with Liberated. So sometimes I'll go by Liberated Ethnic Studies Coalition. Sometimes they go by National Coalition for Liberated Ethnic Studies, but the word liberated is generally in there. It is driven by academics. Academics that refer to themselves as scholar activists. This is not something that they're hiding. They are very forward about it. They say that our number one priority is to be activists. It's to push the specific ideology into schools because it's liberatory. This is what they talk about. The most important thing is liberatory education. So where does it come from? It comes from a very large group of ethnic studies academics. They have been organizing for a super long time. This has been a very concerted effort, waiting for the right time to propagate and get it into the schools. And now is the time. So starting from after the murder of George Floyd, that's when the movement really took off. In terms of funding, a little bit hard to say. So some of the funding is definitely coming from the same places that AROC gets, the Arab Resource and Organizing Center. AROC is a major, major partner of the LESMC, the Liberated folks. It's the same funding that anything with the words Teach Palestine gets. So if you want to understand those sources, that's where you would look. I will tell you the truth, we have not had a moment to catch our breaths and study the sources of this funding. But what I can tell you is we can guess where those sources are. And to give them credit, much of it is sheer brute force. This group of activists is putting a ton of effort into taking advantage of the current momentum in the country, and in a way pulling the wool over people's eyes and saying, hey, we need to address racism, we need to teach history honestly, and they're doing a good job. The only way that we can confront it is by educating ourselves and spreading the word, shining as big a light as possible on these issues. Let me see, how did it originate, who's funding? Yeah, okay, so I think we'll pause there and we can explore this question farther. All right, I'm going to go back to sharing the screen. Okay. All right, so speaking of, this is a perfect segue into what has been happening recently. And this is a comprehensive campaign that they have actually launched, I would say, in the past half a year even. There is a proposal that happened in the last couple of months in the UC system, the University of California system, to require specifically the liberated ethnic studies curriculum. So all the stuff that I was just showing you together with the Teach Palestine toolkit, to require the liberated ethnic studies curriculum in order for students to gain admission. So think about what that means for a moment. That means that not only is ethnic studies in general required, because that's already the law, right? They didn't need to say anything about that because that's a law in the state of California. But rather, the UCs will require of its applicants that they have liberated ethnic studies on their transcript, which means that every single school in California, private, public, charter, will now need to teach this form of ethnic studies. This is a proposal that's currently in front of the Faculty Senate. It will be going to the UC Regents in May. I hope you won't be hearing from us because I'm hoping that it'll be squashed before it comes to the Regents, but you may be. There's a new bill right now in the California legislature to credential teachers. This refers to a supplementary credential that will be done by the liberated folks. You can't see that in the bill itself. We know that it came from the LESMC group, and because of the intricacies, the nuances of how credentialing works in general, state of California and in other states, what it translates into is that the LESMC would have a monopoly on credentialing teachers in this space. It has to do with the fact that they own the academic field, as I was mentioning, in ethnic studies, and that's where the credentialing comes from. Note, by the way, that you don't need credentialing in things like US history. You get credentialing in social studies. However, what they're trying to do is create this separate field that they can own. I'll skip one because it's complicated. We can come back to it if people are interested. There is a national plan. There's actually a map to roll out LESMC across the US. They ran a webinar to share with all of their constituents what the map looks like. You can see all the dots throughout the entire country where they're planning on rolling out this curriculum. All right. So the big question, what can you do? There is fortunately quite a bit that you can do, that every single one of us can do. And it includes reaching out to administrators, school board members, superintendents, building enough of a relationship to be able to ask questions. You could jump in and ask those questions to begin with. I would recommend doing it nicely and not in a confrontational way, because the first set of questions is pretty innocuous and neutral. It's how is the curriculum going to be created? How's it going to be approved? Where in the process? Every district in California is somewhere in the process of adopting ethnic studies. So there's a very natural question in there of where are you in the process? Are you at the very beginning of it? Well, that allows for a lot more flexibility. It allows you to bring us in, for example, to help them figure out how to bring in a constructive ethnic studies curriculum. Are you late in the process and the committee is stacked with liberated people? Well, that could involve a lot more public pressure rather than having one-on-one conversations. What community oversight is available? How are taxpayer dollars being spent? And what organizations are helping with the curriculum development and teacher training? Is it these LESMC folks? Information is everything. So I can't emphasize enough to educate yourself and to educate others around you. So there's a toolkit that we have. I'll also put it into the chat as we wrap up so that you have it, that takes you through whether you want to be involved on a very small level or in a big level. It takes you through what you can do, and you can choose a whole range of options of what you can do to get started organizing a group or just to do something yourself. You can write letters, you can attend school board meetings to stay informed. You can get yourself on either a school committee or a district committee that is working specifically with ethnic studies. Spread the word in every way possible. And let us know how you'd like to get more involved. We will absolutely plug you into other groups that are working on the same issues. Okay, I am going to stop sharing. I'm going to put a couple things into the chat, which are, first of all, the toolkit. 1 second. Okay. And then we can go through and folks can ask whatever questions they want. Or if not, then I'll make up things. Rebecca, I think you were saying something we can't hear you. Or she could be saying something to others. Okay, so this one, what I just put in there is the local action toolkit. And I'm also going to put in an local action alert that we're doing right now. You will be the very first group to get this because there's an email that's going out with this in the next couple of days. But as long as I'm talking to you, I figured I will share with you. This is specifically about a number of events that have been happening, including a district that Castro Valley District that has officially signed a contract with the LESMC. As far as we know, this is the very first district that has signed on the dotted line, saying officially this will be the group that is providing our teacher training and is providing our curriculum development. Arguably, this is against what the law had stated because they are supposed to have public meetings, but as always, there are loopholes, there are all sorts of things that can happen where they can work around it. All right. Question, where are the teachers' unions in this process? That is an excellent question. Teacher unions are not on our side. Unfortunately, this effort is being supported by teacher unions. Any of you that have been involved with teacher unions are familiar with the idea that they tend to have a couple of people that are driving it, a couple of people that are in leadership roles that have gotten into those leadership roles because they are activists and they have a specific thing that they're trying to accomplish. And then everybody else in the teachers union is either not paying attention or they feel pressure to go along. And this is precisely what we have as a case with the California Teachers Association, the CTA, which is the California Teachers Union, which is 100% in bed with the LESMC. In fact, some of their folks are also key leadership with the LESMC. You have the same situation on a national level with the National Education Association, the NEA, and the AFT, American Federation of Teachers. Those are the #1 and #2 teachers unions. Same thing, very much supportive of this type of liberated ethnic studies. Does that mean that it's hopeless? Not at all. What it means is that we need more and more parents and teachers to understand what it's about so that they can push back. But it is important to know that the leadership of the unions are on board with this type of ethnic studies. Okay, other question. Also, who are the group's advisors that school districts should go to for these curricula? Okay, so there are lots of different options for this. There are multiple curricula that are available that they can look at. An organization called FAIR, F-A-I-R, has a curriculum that they are promoting among schools. It's a constructive curriculum that is a really positive one that absolutely talks about history, racism, everything that they would want to be teaching in ethnic studies. So they can absolutely go to them. We have a curriculum, ACES, that has pulled together pieces of the ESMC, pieces of FAIR, and pieces of other curricula. The Los Angeles Unified School District, LAUSD, has a curriculum online. This is the largest district in California, has a curriculum online that can be adopted. This is not rocket science. This is not the sort of thing that every district needs to go to and develop from scratch. These curricula are out there. So the short answer is, if you have somebody that you can send to get advisors and to get groups advising them, send them to us. We'll plug them into all sorts of advisors and groups that could do it. We'll put all sorts of resources at their disposal.
Great. I bet you we've got lots of questions, even with a small group here. Let me take the first one, and then we'll hear others. I would say it's confusing sometimes as a Jewish leader because I get different inputs from different places. So, a while ago it was like, okay, Governor Newsom has, rejected this and we're all good in terms of a state level. And I get that there's a lot of other pieces to this. How would you kind of guide and lead in terms of that issue? And then we'll hear from Diana and then Alan.
That is such a big question. So I want to spend a bit of time talking about this. A Jewish value has never been unity on anything. And yet we often try to become united around particular issues. This one has been a really tough one. There are groups that want to really push all the way and say, look, no matter what you do with the subject, with ethnic studies, it's going to be rotten to the core because this is what happened in academia. Fight to beat ethnic studies, period. There are others that are saying, look, ethnic studies is here to stay and we need to play nice with all, and that liberated ethnic studies is here to stay. We need to play nice. We need to figure out how to make it a reality. We need to negotiate with them. And there's everything in between. There was an attempt by the Jewish community to put in safeguards or guardrails, rather. I don't know how many of you have heard that term, guardrails for AB 101, which was the law that created the requirement. I think what we're currently seeing is those guardrails not working. Our hope, and one of those guardrails, by the way, was one from ACES, the one that talked about, if any of you have looked at the bill, there's a portion there that talks about that the district should not be using rejected material from the ethnic studies model curriculum, that it's legislative intent to not use rejected material. Why is it not working? Well, you can look at different things. First of all, legislative intent. That's not the same as you are not allowed to do so. That's simply saying the legislative intent is. 2, who's going to stop them? There is no body established to be watching this. There's no oversight body. It's us. We are basically the oversight body. 3, let's say somebody is overseeing this and they find that a law is being broken. In this case, for example, this Castro Valley example I was giving you, very possible that they are breaking parts of AB 101. Who's going to bring it forward? Somebody has to be willing to step forward and be the plaintiff. And that somebody has to be someone that is immediately touched by this situation, is involved in the district itself. So there are all sorts of complications that goes deeper than, that's to say that this is a really, really complicated issue. It is not surprising that there are so many different takes in the Jewish community on how to go about addressing it. My advice would be skeptical of everything. Be skeptical of what I'm saying, be skeptical of what others are saying. Try to get the information, try to read between the lines, try to understand the issues. This is super nuanced, super complicated. Anybody that tells you we're good for the next 5 years, don't believe them. That would be my general piece of advice. Anything on this front for the next 5 years, because it'll take at least that long for us to get a handle on this and get to the point where we're good. Assume that we're not, and push and find out, well, how are we good? What makes you say that? What about this? What about that? What we're seeing right now is all our biggest fears coming true and rolling out throughout California and the US. So the guardrails that we were hoping would work, I think that it's safe to say that they are not doing what we had hoped they would do. I know we could talk about this much longer. Rabbi Ezra, do you want to go deeper, or should we go to some of the other questions and then come? Okay.
I have a question. I have a couple of comments. Funding wise, my understanding that the California math framework that's being labeled as racist is funded by the Bill Gates Foundation. I don't know why they would be lowering the standard of, math in California and elsewhere, but correct me if I'm wrong on that one. And the reason I bring that up is because this is all part of the same theme. Math is racist. All of this is sweeping into English classes, social studies. The other is the pushback, right? So the concern with parents are they're being labeled as domestic terrorists when they push back. There's how should I say it, a bias that concerned parents somehow are part of the problem, at least as mainstream media is portraying it. And so the other issue is that it's being hidden by other names like social emotional learning or DEI, right? So I'm hoping you can comment on how, like I've been sitting on the Hillview, my middle school, site council for many, many, many months now, asking, well, which curriculum are you guys gonna adopt? Which curriculum? And it was to be determined until today's meeting, they announced what it was, but nobody discussed it. Nobody, this was top down from apparently the superintendent. And I've personally reached out to him. There's no discussing any alternatives. So what do we, so my question, sorry, I spoke a lot. So I'm part of FAIR. I know that there's about 200 Bay Area parents that are concerned, but we're not divided by school. And so I would love to pursue this if I knew there were at least 3 or 4 other parents within a certain school that are willing to come and, talk. Is that something ACES and FAIR are going to be doing, is actually per school dividing us and organizing us? That's my ultimate question.
That was a lot. All right, let's go in reverse order. Yes, FAIR and ACES are working together. It wouldn't be by schools, it would be by districts. And yes, we're working on figuring out how to do this district by district. It's hard because it needs volume. But yes, we are absolutely working on that. And please get in touch with me to talk about some more this. Before I forget, I am going to put down our general studies at gmail.com. This is our general email. And this is my personal one. Okay. Next, what you were saying in terms of behind closed doors, superintendent pushing it through, this, I totally get the frustration. And this is exactly what Rabbi Ezra was saying. Well, what are we supposed to do when Governor Newsom comes out and says, this is not going to see the light of day? We got to believe him, right? So what are we supposed to do when things aren't going the way that they're supposed to go? Super frustrating. And this is one of the challenges in this, right? Because you can't believe anyone. So on the one hand, we have Governor Newsom stands up 2 years ago and says, this draft will never see the light of day. He vetoes one of the bills, says that it's not ready. The ESMC is not ready. It still has bias, So we think, okay, we're good. And then all of a sudden we see that very same draft that we were promised will never see the light of day is now marching its way through California. So it's a little bit this Orwellian world that we're living in, where black is white. We're being told that something is absolutely not going to happen. We're good. And sure enough, it turns out that we're not good. And the same is happening with what you're describing in terms of superintendent. You have to stay on top of it because things suddenly happen. And then you're in a position where you have to kind of roll back and figure out, well, how did this happen? And did they break a law? And if they did, what are we going to do about it? And so on, because they are supposed to be doing this as of AB 101 passing. They're supposed to be having public meetings. What you're telling me is a story that is repeating itself of superintendents making decisions behind closed doors. And that is the only way to stop that is to insist on transparency and for parents to stand up against that. In terms of the public pushback, the pushback from parents resulting in this media idea of parents being labeled domestic terrorists, whatever. As much as you can, you have to let it roll off you. Parents insisting on transparency and accountability and seeing what their children are learning, we know that we are not being domestic terrorists by doing so. So to the extent that it's possible, I think that we keep going and we know the work that we are doing is important. And that said, be respectful. We never advocate for any kind of disrespectful discourse. Be respectful, be fact-based, and insist that information be shared. Parents absolutely deserve the right to understand what is being taught. I don't know that I can say much more than that, other than to offer sympathy that yes, that's frustrating and that's happening, and we keep going anyway. In terms of SEL and DEI, so social emotional learning, SEL, and DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion efforts, there's definitely a lot of relationship and it's all interconnected. I would say being aware that these things are interconnected is good. And the most important thing you could do is insist again on transparency, understanding, oh, there's DEI training for teachers. I'm interested in seeing the materials for that. You are well within your rights to do that because it impacts how the kids are learning. I'm working with a number of groups actually that are interested in creating DEI alternatives that are constructive alternatives that would go a long way to being able to address this. Yes, it often goes under the guise of social emotional learning, SEL. So don't just be looking for the words ethnic studies. Those words are important as well. The math thing, boy, you hit on like all the related stuff. Yes, there is a math equity thing going on that's around the California mathematics framework that talks about math being a way to propagate white supremacy, that talks about the idea that teachers should not be insisting on the right answer, that when teachers insist the students show their work, that is promoting white supremacy, all sorts of things like that. I think, frankly, I think that it's actually working in our favor because the more ludicrous the stuff is, the easier it is to bring it to the surface and to make people see how crazy and how off the rails some of this can go. Why is the Bill Gates Foundation supporting it? You know, we've tried to figure that out. At first, we thought that maybe it was unwittingly because they didn't understand what was really behind it. That doesn't seem to be the case anymore. It seems like there are particular constituents within the Bill Gates Foundation that really want to promote this particular agenda. I don't think that I have enough information to be able to explain why they're promoting it. It seems weird to me. If we had infinite amount of time, we would go and try to figure out why and how they could possibly be supporting this. That one is one that we haven't paid as much attention to as I wish we could.
Good. You know, Alina, there are a couple interesting questions in the chat. Cheryl wants, you know, just this whole thing of the teachers union, so supportive of it. Can you elaborate a little more? It just feels,
Why?
again, so dissonant.
Yeah.
And then Anna wrote, you know, Anna's a teacher, by the way, in San Francisco Public Schools. If public meetings are required under the act, is there a chance of pushing Brown Act violations like it's been done in SFUSD?
You froze there, Rabbi.
And then we'll go to Alan's questions and then to Ken. Oh, you're not a teacher sorry, in San Jose. I'll get it right. Got to get my details right.
And by the way, can somebody put Anna's, Anna, get in touch with me, please, because we're very interested in talking to teachers. So you could either put your email address in the chat if you feel like it, just to me, or feel free to email me separately. Okay, let's start with Cheryl's. Can I elaborate on why the unions are so supportive of Liberate Ethnic Studies model? You know, to do that, so we would have to go into the nature of the leaders of teacher unions. They lean toward very progressive left. And by the way, I should do among us, I will just do a disclaimer that ACES is absolutely a nonpartisan organization. We have a mix of right wing, left wing. Frankly, the majority of us are Democrats. I'm a long-term Democrat. The vast majority of the leadership is. I tell you that so that you understand that this is not a left-right issue. It is, however, a far left versus many other parts of the spectrum issue in some ways. And the teacher unions is one of the ways that this is true. So it tends to be that the leadership of the teacher unions have a particular ideological perspective that is that is perfectly aligned with the liberated ethnic studies perspective. And to go deeper than that, we'd have to study where that comes from. But that is that's an artifact of where we are today. This is true nationally. This is true. We're hearing this from every state that reaches out to us, that in their states, the leadership of the teacher unions tends to be aligned with liberated ethnic studies because they are aligned ideologically. So I'll leave it at that. And if somebody wants to do more research on this, I would welcome it. Okay, next question. We'll go to, okay, so Anna was asking, I think this is Anna, public meetings are required under the act. Is there a chance of pushing violations? There is a chance. Again, it has to do with, that's why it's super important to watch, first of all. There's no oversight body, as I said, we are the oversight. So it's really important when these things happen, like is happening in Castro Valley District and other districts. It's really important to report it, let us know, and we will reach out to people within those districts to see who could possibly file this as a violation. Suing districts is hard. It requires, again, a plaintiff. Filing administrative complaints is easier, and we have to pick and choose what the priorities are. But yes, it is absolutely possible to file complaints against violations like this. It's, on the other hand, it's not that hard, depending on what the violation is, for them to get out of it, saying, so in Castro Valley's case, for instance, they argued that, well, this is not curriculum development, this is actually professional development. They made a mistake, and on the proposal itself in big letters, it says curriculum development. They forgot to remove those words, curriculum development. So that's a situation where somebody can pursue it, and they're looking, folks in Castro Valley are looking at that. So it's a mix. Sometimes, yes, you can absolutely pursue it.
Let's go to Alan's home.
Yes.
Alan, the Fisher home.
You're muted, Alan. Alan.
I've had it muted for a while, forgot that it was. Sorry. By the way, Anna is my daughter-in-law, and just to, you see the Fisher name there. We've spoken about this a bit before. The first, two questions. One is, the guardrails were put in part by the Jewish caucus in Sacramento. Are they going to do something like trying to interfere with the teacher credentialing by the liberated ethnic studies people? Because they should have some, you owe me on this. And the other thing about the Brown Act and so on is that they have public meetings. They just make up their minds before them. I went to the Sequoia Union School District Board meeting more than a year and a half back, something like that, to ask what they were going to do. And they had a presentation on the plans for ethnic studies. And so they had this slide presentation, and it quoted verbatim from the Critical Ethnic Studies Draft 1. And I asked, here you are quoting from this, even though you say you're going to draft your own curriculum, you're quoting from it. And I was told, oh, you're just making a straw man argument because we're going to write our own curriculum. And then when I kept asking after months for the curriculum that they're supposed to develop, it never showed up. They never talk about it. And, so they have a public meeting. Minds are made up before the meeting starts. Then they have a for-show public meeting, and then they vote to do what they were going to do anyway. And that complies with the law, as far as I know. I'm no lawyer, but it sounds like it complies with the law.
What you just described does, yes, unfortunately. So it wouldn't fall into what I was describing, where they're not doing a public meeting. this is not that. So you're absolutely right. It would comply with the law, which is one of the problems that we have with the guardrails and part of the reason they're not exactly working. The question about, speaking of guardrails and the Jewish caucus. Yes, in the ideal, the Jewish caucus would absolutely be pushing for their colleagues to do something, because this is an example where they took a leap of faith and they went for it. They approved AB 101, they supported AB 101. It hasn't worked, and the Jewish community is getting damaged. And this is one of the things that we're going to be working with them on and asking them to consider working with their colleagues on, whether it's a bill, whether it's working district by district, whether it's working with the State Board of Education, but doing something to fix the fact that things have gone off the rails, and it's only the beginning. We have hardly begun, and things are already going off the rails. So I don't want to get into, we could go down a very deep rat hole on what the Jewish caucus can and can't do, what they could and couldn't do. They're in a tough place. I have sympathy for them, and we are absolutely going to be encouraging them and pushing them to do something. And work with their colleagues to fix this from their angle. Yes, one of the credentialing bill is one of the areas where we're going to have to be working on them and with them, and this is coming right up. This is actually a bill that's going before the academic committee that the education committee within a month.
Great, thank you. Let's go to Ken, and then we'll go to Daniel and Anna's home.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I'm originally not from this area. I did work in the Cleveland schools for many years. And so I haven't done anything in California. Really interested in what everyone's doing. This has been very enlightening to me. But I have some other observations if I can make them. One is, when I was in Cleveland, I was able to bring programs into the schools with sort of controversial subjects, but not be accredited teachers, sort of like a guest speaker type of thing, or part of my program to describe. I feel, when I just walked in here today, that I was in a meeting in Congress. I mean, it just seemed like so much political groups, looking for their turf. And I got frustrated. Because there's just like everyone wants, they have their agenda. And what I'm hoping, I don't know if I hear it or not, that there could be some connection. And one way for connection for me is to let go of our opinions in a certain way. I mean, we all are very, very eager to express our opinions. But to see if we can find a way to connect to people, like salesmanship, because this is a great program. This is needed. I hate, when I was in a Cleveland school, in terms of anti-Semitism, it was horrible. I wouldn't say it was purposely horrible, because these kids didn't know, and the faculty didn't care. They had no relationship to it. And there are very few teachers of Jewish that are in the inner city, and they don't have the background. So I just felt like coming in as an outsider might be a good approach. And my question really is, why is there I feel, maybe I'm wrong, and you've been at this a long time, Leah, so tell me I'm wrong, that there's like a turf war going on here.
Are you, just to be clear, are you asking about a turf war between the different types of ethnic studies?
No.
Is that the
how it gets off the ground?
Or more with, can you hold the
How it
mic?
gets off the ground? How do we make it happen? How, I heard about the ethnic studies teachers, and to me, unfortunately, I have to express my opinion, and usually it's not right, but in any case, ethnic studies teachers, to me, are people that have studied ethnic studies. Many of them have come from disadvantaged backgrounds, but they're looking for a job, and they're looking for something that they can preach to, to the choir about, to the students. And they're not like, they've lost touch with their neighborhoods and things like that. And I just feel like there's a lot of different groups that want things in a certain way. It doesn't feel to me that this is going to come together the way it should be. Unfortunately, I hope I'm wrong. It just doesn't feel that way. It is too much acrimony here. And correct me if I'm wrong, please.
Well, I think you're absolutely right that there's quite a bit of acrimony. For a second, I'm going to share a screen to show you why I believe that there is no, in some cases, such as in this one, I don't think that there's much room for negotiating with a group that basically says the following. Hold on. I'm gonna-
Alina, you know that picture is 1,000 words? You have that picture of the constructive ethnic studies versus the revolutionary.
Yeah, I'll
I
find
think,
that.
you know
Sure.
what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
I feel like
Um,
that sums it up. I mean, I
Yeah.
don't think anyone here has any issue teaching about different cultures, different backgrounds, but I think what ACEs and what FAIR, and certainly as a parent, what I would want my kids is to learn it in a pro-human way, where what makes us stronger, what unites us as a human, as a human race, instead of creating more tribalism and division by pegging students against each other. And that's what's happening in our classrooms. I mean, I'm part of a bunch of parent groups where we're getting daily, reports of my kids were segregated into, affinity groups based on skin color, and then told to do X, Y, and Z exercise. It's 10
So-
years from now, the implications is what I'm worried about.
Sure. So look at hopefully people can see my screen. In the right-hand side, the Zionists have no place in the classroom. That is a screenshot from a training webinar by the Liberated Ethnic Studies leadership team. I would venture an opinion that it is almost impossible, if not entirely impossible, to negotiate with a group that believes I and my children have no place in the classroom, to discuss with them how they could please let me be or my children in the classroom. So I think this is part of the fundamental difference where this type of curriculum this type of curriculum is simply not what belongs in the classroom. And unfortunately, there's not really that much room for coming together on it. It's a very particular approach, and this type of thinking is an integral part of that thinking. I sympathize with the opinion that wouldn't it be great if we could come together on this, because it is a worthy subject. And I do believe, as I said, that ethnic studies is a very important subject. Unfortunately, that's where we are. Let's see, Diana just said to look at, let me see if I can show you a past a picture that shows a couple of book covers that show differences in approaches to ethnic studies. Oh, here we go. Okay. So here, you can look at two models of ethnic studies. If you can see the difference between two approaches. One of them
If you go full
is,
screen on that, it's easier to see.
oh yeah, let's see. No, hold on a moment. I need to download it. Hang tight. Okay.
There we go.
So we've got on the left-hand side, kind of the tapestry of different cultures and different ethnicities. And on the right-hand side, this idea, the arm up in the air and this revolutionary approach. And by the way, note that it's not that we think that any kind of revolutionary approach has absolutely no place in the classroom. It can certainly be discussed among other approaches of confronting racism and addressing our society's challenges. The issue is that this is the cover. This is the ideology, and that is the ideology that brings forth the anti-Semitism and the anti-Zionism. I'm going to stop sharing.
Let's go
All right.
to Daniel and Anna.
Hello. I just wanted to say a couple of things, both as an alum of SFUSD and as a current teacher, just kind of as a teacher's perspective, if it's possible, on what things look like from, like kind of the way districts and other things work. So when I was at SFUSD as a student, I wouldn't necessarily say that we had a whole lot of maybe institutionalized anti-Semitism per se, but there certainly were individual teachers that would say this or that. And honestly, I feel like we as students are pretty unequipped to handle, and a lot of students just kind of wanted to step away from it. What I'm afraid of in terms of the stakes of all this is having gone to college after that and seeing the level of vitriol and the level of vitriol that was directed towards us, to the point of being threatening, that would never have happened to another group. And I tried to address this at a San Francisco school board meeting where I intended to speak about Lowell. I had no intention of speaking about this, but the president of the board made this offhand remark about those I think she said something about how those certain people at the state level are, compromising our ability to have ethnic studies or something of that kind. And what I've observed is, unfortunately, there's a group of people, including the 32 something members of the ethnic studies curriculum, who let the first part pass. And the SFUSD, which actually piloted, one of the first groups to actually really work with the liberated ethnic studies people and kind of pilot this curriculum. They're really true believers. Like, they're not people who are just like, oh, I don't really know what's going on. They are true 100% unapologetic believers. And I'm just wondering, kind of after I say my other thought, I'm curious as to what your thought is for how to handle that kind of situation. The other thing I want to say was I heard a couple of questions about why things are the way they are in terms of teachers unions, in terms of credentialing, et cetera, et cetera. Most teachers unions, now that there's a law that says that you can either opt in or opt out of political contributions to the union. So there's a separate pod for union activity versus political activity. And on the one hand, it's great for people who don't want their hard-earned money to go towards the political nonsense that happens, that a few people at the union take care of. On the other hand, that also means that the only people who have political power in the union through these political committees are those who think a very particular way because they are okay with their money being put there. And that's a reality that we would have to contend with, because that's simply the structure of unions in California. I don't know if it's a structure of unions in other states as well. I just wanted to bring that up as kind of a comment about that structure. And then one other structure I want to address really quickly was the structure of credentialing. So credentialing is done through the California Credential Board. They're very cut and dry once it comes to it. So usually there's a big furor about whatever thing is about to come up. Like, for example, English language learning, now the math curriculum, ethnic studies curriculum, everyone pays attention to that. And then there's a document that comes out as a result of these things being settled through law or through sometimes through referendum, etc. And that piece of paper ends up saying on it which groups are allowed to certify someone in a certain area. And the amount of, there's already a lot of politics in it, at least as I've observed, of trying to get a credential in English language learning where there are only 5 programs that are allowed to do it, and all of them magically taught exactly the same courses. It costs exactly the same amount, regardless whether it's a UC, a CSU, a private college. So there's a bit of the question is, who has the power to look into who makes those decisions of which groups get to do this credentialing? And I don't know the answer to that, but I guess what I'm saying is there's some kind of political machination that must be happening in terms of who gets to get you certified in something. And from the perspective of trying to fight this, perhaps one way of fighting it is to look into who has that power and to see if there are ways that we can get alternative bodies to be able to give this certification. So that was a lot. I'm sorry, but I just wanted to make a note of that just from kind of the other side.
Sure. Okay, so let's go in reverse order again. In terms of who has the power of deciding which groups have the power on credentialing, that theoretically would come from the governor's office, which oversees administrative bodies such as the credentialing body. It puts a lot of stock into the California Department of Education, and there's a connection between, there's a dotted line between those two bodies. The credentialing body is supposed to be independent, but there is a dotted line connection. Our hope is not to get to this point and to not have the bill pass, because once it passes, it will become very, very difficult to make an argument that anybody other than this body of teachers, this body of scholar activists who are insisting that they own the field of ethnic studies by virtue of being owning the academic field of ethnic studies, the university field of ethnic studies, it will become very, very difficult to fight it on their turf. So at this point, we're hoping to not get to that and simply not have this bill pass. And that will be, for a while, that will be our focus with respect to credentialing. You said a lot of really important and useful things, Hannah. I apologize, I didn't quite catch when you said that, when your question was how to handle this situation. Can you summarize again what situation you're describing? Just in a couple sentences, how to handle what situation?
How to handle situations of districts that are true believers, as opposed to districts that are just like, oh, they seem like they're legit because
Got
they're real. They're
Thank
the
you.
OGs, they're legit. They're
Yeah. Thank you for drawing that distinction, because it is such an important distinction to understand who your audience is. And there are definitely districts who are true believers, although what often happens is that a couple of people within that district are true believers and the rest are just kind of going along. It's kind of the analogy, it's similar to what's happening in the unions. So we rarely, if ever, find a situation where the entire body of a district, the entire board, are true believers. It is most often one or two people. However, it is often true that the one or two people have managed to convert the board, and it is too late for frank one-on-one conversations behind the scenes and having private talks and so on. And this, by the way, will now come full circle to some of the questions that Rabbi Ezra was asking about within the Jewish community, the different approaches and who's right and how do you navigate between those. We recommend a very particular approach, and note, by the way, that ACES is not a Jewish organization per se, because we work with groups across the spectrum, but many of us are Jews and are in this from a Jewish perspective personally. What we are always wary of the argument of we work behind the scenes. And the reason for that is, in some cases, that makes perfect sense. In the cases where, whether it's the board, the district's administration, or legislators are either neutral or are on our side, but have simply had the wool pulled over their eyes. Makes perfect sense to work behind the scenes and to work with them through the education process. On the other hand, if you have a situation like you're describing, Anna, where they're true believers and there is no negotiating and there is no educating, the only thing that will work in that situation is public pressure. And what does public pressure mean? It means parents writing in, it means action alerts, it means letters to the editor, it means trying to get the media involved to say, we had 800 signatures on such and such a letter on this issue. It means everything that has to do with exposing and putting public pressure. It's unfortunate that those are the two means that we have at our disposal. It's the private behind the scenes and it's a public pressure, and it's super important to know which one needs to happen when. Be wary of strategies that are only behind the scenes, and it is always in the interest of the particular districts to say, work with us one-on-one behind the scenes. So it's important to understand, are these the true believers? Are these the ones that are, I'm not going to win no matter what behind the scenes? And if so, that can't be an option. On the other hand, again, if they're neutral or on our side, potentially, then absolutely behind the scenes is an important tool. Anna, does that get to answer your question? Because I think it's a really important one.
Yes, thank you.
We can help with both, with the private conversations in terms of how to pose the various questions respectfully and from a point of information, and also with any kind of efforts to do action alerts, to do public pressure. We actually have helped districts before set up their own web pages and set up their campaigns so that they can get, in an easy way, get people to sign letters and to get as much of this exposed as possible. I think that we are almost out of time. So unless there is a burning question, I would love to wrap up. Is that good? That's
I
right.
think we're good.
Okay. Okay, so I just wanted to say a few words as we close this. Besides all my thank yous, I'm really grateful to, again, to Diana and to Alan and Rabbi Ezra and to Rebecca, and to you for your time and for your Zoom bleary eyes. I really think that this is a long game. This is not, we're going to have victory step by step. And every time you have a meeting with a school board member or a superintendent or even a parent, every one of those is a small victory. We're in this for the long term, and I truly believe that what we're doing here is nothing short of deciding how the next generation of Americans are going to interact with each other overall, and whether an entire generation of Jewish kids are going to think of themselves as oppressors and of Israel as the oppressor. And that's not to mention what others will think of our kids and the anti-Semitism that we're already seeing. I do think that ethnic studies has the opportunity to elevate the conversation that we're having in this country about racism, to build bridges and to bring students and groups together, but not if it puts them into these boxes that we talked about and pitting them against each other. So the only way that we're going to get there is if each and every one of us gets involved in whatever way you can, because if we don't, we all fail, and we just can't afford to. The stakes are too high. So thank you for your time and your energy and your passion, and I welcome anybody to reach out with questions, concerns, and however you would like to get involved.
Thanks so much, Alina. What a really powerful night and a thoughtful and important presentation, and a call to all of us to really be part of this long game. So appreciate it.